As the 1930s were coming to an end, factories in America were at a turning point from old problems to new changes. The time of the Great Depression had hurt businesses, closing down many buildings and leaving lots of people without jobs. Making things like steel, cars, and machines was starting to get better little by little. But the country's businesses were not yet ready to make enough for a big global war that seemed likely. By 1939, the United States seemed more interested in fixing things at home than getting ready for war, and its factories, even though there were many, were not set up to make weapons well. This business situation was very different from Germany and Japan, where the countries had already changed their factories to make weapons. Still, even though it was not obvious, the United States had a lot of potential that had not been used yet. This potential would soon surprise everyone in the world. One of the main things about America's businesses before the war was that they could change easily. Unlike Europe, where the governments told businesses to make things for the military, the United States still did well by giving people what they wanted to buy. Factories in Detroit made millions of cars. General Electric made home items, and shipyards made boats for business instead of warships. But these businesses had become very good at making lots of things quickly in the 1920s and 1930s. Henry Ford's idea of a moving line to put things together meant that American factories could make many more things very fast when they needed to. This skill was not being used much during the Depression, but it was the base for the big changes that came later. The Depression years also helped new technology grow. Even when people were not buying much, engineers made better machines, created lighter metals, and improved ways to make things the same. American factories could make parts that could be switched out with each other on a scale that was not seen anywhere else. This focus on being effective and making things the same would later be very important in making more things than Germany, where many weapons were still made by hand or in smaller shops. By the late 1930s, companies like Boeing and Douglas had tried making planes on a large scale, even if not many people wanted to buy them. When the war created a need, these tests became plans for quickly getting ready for war. Another thing that changed businesses before the war was the workers. Many people still did not have jobs in the early years, but by the time Roosevelt created the New Deal programs, many people had started working again through public projects. This made a group of workers who were used to new ways of organizing, being disciplined, and learning new skills. Unions became stronger, getting better work situations and pay. But they also made a more organized workforce that was ready to help when the country asked. Because there were so many skilled workers who were not being used enough, factories would not have trouble finding people to run their machines once they needed to make a lot more. It is also important to remember that America's land and resources made it certain that businesses would grow once the war started. Big supplies of coal and iron helped steel factories in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Chicago. Oil areas in Texas and California gave the energy for machines and cars. Extra food from farms allowed many farm workers to leave and go work in city factories. No other country had such a mix of resources, people ready to work, and industrial skills. Germany was skilled and determined, but did not have enough resources. Japan was eager but had very few resources. America was the only one with all three, but it was not using them fully in 1939. But there were still problems. Many people in politics and society did not want to prepare for war. The money set aside for buying military equipment was still low. In 1939, only a few thousand planes were made, which was far less than what would be needed later. Almost no tanks were being made, and the U.S. Army used old ones. The Navy had a strong fleet, but even the places where ships were built were not working as well as they could. These problems might have looked like weaknesses, but they really meant that America's factories had a lot of extra space to grow. So as World War II was about to start, American factories were not yet making weapons for democracy. Instead, they were like a giant that was asleep. The factories in Detroit, the mills in Pittsburgh, and the shipyards on the east and west coasts were running, but not as much as they could. The skills were there, the resources were plenty, and the workers were ready. All that was needed was something to start it all. Changing a country focused on buying things into the biggest war industry ever. That start would come when Roosevelt asked people to fight. And in 2 years, American factories would make more than Germany and all of its allies combined. When Franklin Roosevelt spoke to the country in December 1940 and said that America must become the place that makes weapons for democracy, it was more than just words. It was an order that began one of the most amazing changes in how things are made. Even before Pearl Harbor, the United States had started using its factories to help Britain and other allied countries by lending them things. Factories that used to make fridges, radios, or cars now started making rifles, artillery shells, and airplane engines. This change did not happen right away or easily, but by 1941 the beginning of a war-focused economy was starting to show. The Lend-Lease Act that passed in March 1941 was very important. It let the U.S. give Britain, China, and later the Soviet Union important war supplies without needing to be paid right away. This plan showed that America was leaning toward getting involved in the war, and it also gave factories huge orders that helped struggling businesses. Shipyards started building destroyers and cargo ships for Britain, while airplane companies filled orders for Hurricanes and Spitfires, along with American designs. Production went up a lot, and so did the number of people working. By the end of 1941, almost 2 million more Americans were working in factories than just 2 years before. The car industry showed how fast things could change. In Michigan, Chrysler engineers started trying out tank designs, while General Motors changed their assembly lines for trucks and airplane engines. Ford's famous River Rouge plant, which was already the biggest factory in the world, was planned to be changed to make bombers. These companies were good at making things cheaply, and Roosevelt's order made them use that skill for the war. The result was a system that could make hundreds of vehicles or airplane parts in the time it took smaller European companies to make dozens. Roosevelt's government did not leave things to chance. In 1940, the government created the National Defense Advisory Commission and then the Office of Production Management to watch over how factories were changing. These groups brought together business leaders, engineers, and union representatives to fix problems, share resources, and make sure things were made the same way. For the first time, Washington worked with private businesses on a large scale to get ready for war. By late 1941, the War Production Board was being planned, which would decide how resources like steel, copper, and rubber were used. This much control, though some criticized it as the government doing too much, was important in making the change from making things for people to making things for war easier. The changes went beyond just how things were managed. The factories themselves changed a lot physically. Car factories removed the tools for making shiny parts and fancy finishes, replacing them with tools for welding tank armor. Electrical companies that used to make things for homes now made radar sets and communication devices. Even typewriter companies like Remington changed to make guns. Every part of industry was affected, creating a situation where things people enjoyed were replaced by things needed for the military. By Christmas of 1941, the sight of cars being made was disappearing, replaced by trucks, jeeps, and engines meant for battle. Maybe the most surprising thing was how fast this happened compared to Germany. While Hitler's government had slowly made industry more focused on the military in the 1930s, America's change from making things for peace to making things for war happened very quickly once the decision was made. Within months of Roosevelt's speech about the arsenal of democracy, the country had contracts worth billions in place, and by the end of 1941, the amount of things being made just for Lend-Lease was so much that people abroad were shocked. British officials visiting American factories were amazed at the size, saying that one Detroit factory made more vehicles in a month than some European countries could in a year. The change in people's minds was just as important as the change in the economy. Roosevelt's speeches made industrial mobilization seem like a moral mission. Factories were not just making weapons. They were protecting democracy itself. Workers were proud of their role even before the U.S. officially joined the war. Union leaders who had fought with management in strikes in the 1930s now encouraged working together, at least for a while, to meet the growing needs. The idea that American factories could be the lifeline for the struggling Allies created a feeling of national purpose that energized the workforce. By December 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the foundation was already there. America did not start from nothing. It joined the war with factories already running, contracts already in place, and factories already changed. The arsenal of democracy was not just a saying anymore. It was becoming real. And in 2 short years, that reality would overwhelm Germany's carefully planned but not good enough production system. Detroit's change in the early years of the war was one of the most amazing changes in how things are made in history. Known as the Motor City, it had long been known for making lots of cars. But after 1941, it became the center of America's war effort that used machines. Factories that used to make shiny Buicks and Packards soon smelled of oil and hot steel as assembly lines changed for tanks, trucks, and jeeps. The change was not just symbolic. It showed that America was fully using its industrial skills for war. The most famous example was the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant. Planned before America officially joined the war, it became the world's biggest bomber factory. Willow Run covered over 3.5 million square feet with assembly lines a mile long that could make B-24 Liberators at a very fast pace. At its best, the plant made one bomber every hour, a speed that shocked both allies and enemies. While Willow Run mainly focused on airplanes, the way it was designed, Ford's way of making lots of things applied to war, was seen in Detroit's other factories. Chrysler Corporation also made a big difference, especially at the Detroit Arsenal tank plant in Warren, Michigan. Finished in 1941, it was the first factory in America built just to make lots of tanks. The plant became the main place for making the M3 Lee and later the M4 Sherman tank, the most important tank for Allied armored divisions. By the end of the war, Chrysler's plant had made over 22,000 tanks, more than any single factory in Germany. The German panzer divisions, though advanced in technology, could not keep up with the number of machines coming out of Detroit. General Motors also helped with the effort. Its divisions spread across the Midwest changed to making military trucks, amphibious vehicles, and airplane engines. GMC trucks became very important for moving people and supplies in many places of war. GM's Allison division made tens of thousands of liquid-cooled airplane engines, powering fighters like the P-38 Lightning. Even Buick, usually a maker of fancy cars, made powertrains and artillery pieces. The ability of these companies to change quickly showed how American industry could be united under the needs of war. Equally important was the making of Jeeps, a vehicle that became a symbol of World War II. Designed by the small company Willys Overland, but made in large numbers with help from Ford, the Jeep showed the idea of making things the same way and being tough and efficient. Lightweight, useful, and easy to fix. Over 600,000 were made between 1941 and 1945. Soldiers often said that Jeeps seemed to be everywhere, from deserts in North Africa to jungles in the Pacific. German officers were said to admire their reliability and large numbers, seeing them as a sign of American ability to provide supplies. Behind this change was the idea of using parts that could be switched out and designs that were the same. Unlike Germany, which often used many different designs and making things by hand, American industry focused on being simple and consistent. The M4 Sherman was not the most advanced tank on the battlefield, but it could be made in large numbers, fixed easily, and sent around the world. The same was true for trucks and Jeeps. This idea meant that once the first changes were done, Detroit could run its factories all the time, knowing that each thing made was the same and ready to use right away. The speed of this change cannot be stressed enough. Within a single year of Pearl Harbor, making cars for people stopped completely and Detroit became a war machine. The change also needed the government and industry to work together on a level never seen before. Contracts made sure profits were guaranteed, while groups watching over things kept resources coming and made sure important projects came first. The results spoke for themselves. By the end of 1942, U.S. factories had made more tanks and military vehicles than Germany had in the last 3 years combined. Detroit's story showed a bigger truth. America's industrial power was not just about size, but about its ability to change quickly and use what it knew about making things for people to make things for the military. Tanks, trucks, and Jeeps made in Michigan moved across Europe, Africa, and Asia, carrying the war effort forward. Germany may have had better designs in some cases, but in the end, the Motor City's constant production buried them under a lot of steel and rubber. If Detroit showed the backbone of the Allied armies that used machines, the skies showed another part of American industrial power. The amount of production was most amazing in the airplane industry. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States made over 300,000 planes, a number that was much bigger than Germany's output, and made sure they had control of the air in many places. What made this possible was the mix of advanced engineering with ways to make lots of things. Ideas that had once made cars and radios now made fighters, bombers, and transport planes. One of the most amazing new things was making real airplane assembly lines at plants like Boeing's in Seattle and Douglas Aircraft's in California. Production was set up as carefully as car factories. Parts, wings, fuselages, and tail sections were made at the same time in different plants and brought together to be put together. This system allowed for speed and efficiency that was not matched in Europe, where airplanes were often built in smaller places with slower, more handmade methods. By 1942, Boeing was making many B-17 Flying Fortresses a day. And by 1944, the company made almost 5,000 bombers in a single year. The B-7, called the Flying Fortress, became one of the most famous symbols of America's ability to make things. Designed for long-range bombing, it needed tens of thousands of parts and careful engineering. But making lots of them made it possible to make thousands, giving the U.S. Army Air Forces the ability to take the war deep into enemy territory. At the same time, the Consolidated Aircraft Corporation's B-24 Liberator, made in huge numbers at the Ford Willow Run plant, became the most made heavy bomber in history with over 18,000 built. Germany never got close to making that many, even when its war economy was at its best. Fighter planes also came off production lines at amazing rates. North American Aviation's P-51 Mustang became one of the most celebrated fighters of the war, offering the distance and ability that allowed bombers to be protected deep into German territory. Originally made to meet a British request, the Mustang's quick development and mass production showed how flexible American design and industry was. Meanwhile, Lockheed's P-38 Lightning and Republic's P-47 Thunderbolt added variety and strength to the Allied air arsenal, each made in the tens of thousands. Equally important was making transport planes. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain, based on the civilian DC-3, became the most important part of air logistics. Its role in carrying troops, supplies, and even pulling gliders during air attacks was very important. More than 10,000 were built, allowing the Allies to move forces and supplies quickly across continents. This logistical advantage made by America's ability to make lots of transport planes gave Allied commanders flexibility that the Axis powers could not copy. Behind these achievements was not just the ability of factories, but also careful planning. The War Production Board made sure that resources like aluminum and high-octane aviation fuel were used first for airplane projects. Universities and research labs worked with industry to make innovation in aerodynamics, engines, and materials faster. By 1943, the United States was not only building planes in bigger numbers than anyone else. It was building better planes with more advanced engines and weapons. The number of workers involved was also amazing. Women workers, who became known as Rosies, in shipyards and plants also played important roles in the airplane industry. At Boeing's Renton plant or at Lockheed's Burbank facility, women put together fuselages and installed parts while men served overseas. Photos of rows of women working on bomber wings became famous images of America's wartime mobilization. This addition of new workers, combined with working all the time, meant factories never stopped. Germany, for its part, had trouble matching this kind of efficiency. While it had technologically advanced airplanes like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the Fowler-Wolf FW-190, production was spread across smaller plants, easily bombed by the Allies, and hurt by not having enough skilled workers and resources. Even the introduction of the jet-powered Mi-262 came too late, and in too few numbers to change the situation. In contrast, American skies were full of many standardized, reliable airplanes, a huge force made not by a few engineers, but by the planned output of thousands of factories and millions of workers. So by the middle years of the war, America's factories had changed the air war. Mass production did not only supply American pilots, but also gave Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies hundreds of airplanes through Lend-Lease. The skies became highways of Allied control, made by the constant sound of American assembly lines. What had started as a careful mobilization in 1940 had by 1943 become an industrial miracle that Germany could not match or stop. While planes filled the skies and tanks moved across battlefields, the war could not have been won without making lots of ships. The oceans were how the Allies got supplies, and Germany's submarine campaign in the Atlantic threatened to make Britain surrender. America did more than just build fighting ships. It completely changed how ships were made. The Liberty Ship program is a prime example of how industry met the urgent needs of wartime on a large scale. These cargo ships were simple, practical, and made to be built in huge numbers like never before. By the end of the war, more than 2,700 had been made, and each could carry thousands of tons of food, weapons, and fuel to the battle areas. The clever part of the Liberty ship was that it was built in pieces. Normally, building ships took skilled workers and a lot of time, often many months for just one ship. But in 1941, shipyards led by businessman Henry J. Kaiser started using ways to build parts ahead of time. Pieces of the hull, deck, and engines were made in different places and then put together at the shipyard like a giant puzzle. This greatly reduced the time it took to build ships. One Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, famously went from starting construction to being launched in less than 5 days in 1942. This was meant to show how fast and efficient the new system was. Building ships went far beyond just cargo ships. America launched hundreds of destroyer escorts, which were very important for protecting groups of ships from German submarine attacks. These smaller, faster ships were made so quickly that by 1943, the once very bad situation in the Atlantic was clearly turning in favor of the Allies. Aircraft carriers were also being produced at a rate that was hard to imagine before the war. The Essex-class carriers, which were the main part of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, were built in more than 20 units. While Japan struggled to replace the carriers they lost at Midway, America's shipyards made new ones faster than the enemy could sink them. Where these shipyards were located was very important. Places like Richmond, California on the West Coast became boomtowns for shipbuilding, employing tens of thousands of workers. In the East, yards in Baltimore, New York, and Norfolk got much bigger. The Gulf Coast also saw new facilities pop up very quickly. This spreading out of production made sure that even when German submarines were in the Atlantic or Japanese forces threatened the Pacific, production kept going. Every area helped, tying the country together in a huge industrial network. The workers in the shipyards created a new social environment. Kaiser's yards in California became well known for hiring many women and African American workers, often for the first time in industrial jobs. The urgent need for wartime production broke down barriers, at least for a while, as workers from different backgrounds worked side by side welding hulls and putting plates together. The work was hard, with many shifts making sure ships were being launched all the time. But the workers were often in good spirits. Ship launches were big celebrations with christenings and ceremonies that reminded workers of their role in the bigger fight. These ships had a huge impact on the war. Liberty ships carried everything from canned food and medical supplies to Sherman tanks and P-51 fighters, helping not only American troops, but also Britain and the Soviet Union. Without this constant flow of supplies, the Eastern Front would have been very different. Destroyer escorts and carriers allowed the Allies to protect supply lines and eventually take the fight back across the oceans, making sure that Allied armies could advance in North Africa, Italy, and later France. The simple, strong Liberty ship, while not glamorous, became the key to global strategy. Germany had nothing like it. Its shipbuilding was still slower, relied on skilled workers, and was limited by a lack of resources. The Marine made strong German submarines, but even those submarines could not sink ships as fast as America could replace them. By 1943, the flood of Liberty ships and escorts changed the situation. Losses of ships in convoys dropped a lot, and Allied supplies grew. Logistics, which is often not noticed in military history, became very important, and America's shipyards were as dangerous as any weapon on the battlefield. In the end, America's ability to build so many ships made sure that no matter how far its armies and navies went, supply lines never broke. Steel hulls welded by regular workers in yards from Maine to California became the silent guarantee of Allied victory. The oceans belonged to those who could keep them supplied, and in that area, America's factories and shipyards were unmatched. The huge machine of American industry could not have worked without the millions of workers who powered it, and among them, women had a role unlike anything the nation had ever seen. With millions of men drafted into the armed forces, factories across the country faced a sudden shortage of workers. Just as the need for tanks, planes, and ships went up a lot, the solution was to bring new groups into the industrial workforce. And women answered that call in record numbers. By 1944, almost 1 in every 3 American workers in manufacturing was a woman, a number that was hard to imagine just a few years before. The cultural symbol of this change was Rosie the Riveter, a made-up character made popular through government posters and a catchy song. With her rolled-up sleeves and confident pose, Rosie represented the millions of women who took on roles that were once only for men. They put together aircraft frames at Boeing, welded ship hulls at Kaiser's yards, and assembled engines at General Motors. The change was not just symbolic. It changed the social structure of the United States. Women discovered both the challenges and the pride of industrial work, earning their own wages and helping directly with the war effort. The size of this effort was amazing. The War Manpower Commission organized recruitment campaigns across the country, encouraging women, retirees, and minorities to take jobs in defense plants. Training programs, often just a few weeks long, prepared women for tasks from using drill presses to reading blueprints. In places like Willow Run, entire shifts of women kept assembly lines moving all the time. Skilled jobs that had once seemed impossible for women, such as machinists, welders, and electricians, suddenly became part of their daily lives. Immigrant and minority workers also played very important roles. African Americans, who had long been kept out of many industrial jobs, gained new opportunities as the need for labor grew very large. Civil rights leaders pushed Roosevelt's administration to make sure hiring practices were fairer, leading to Executive Order 8802 in 1941, which banned discrimination in defense industries. While inequality and segregation continued, tens of thousands of black workers entered factories, helping to build tanks, planes, and ships that would fight overseas. Mexican-American laborers also found opportunities in wartime plants, and the BRITRO program brought temporary Mexican workers to fill agricultural labor shortages, indirectly freeing more Americans for industrial jobs. The human cost of this constant work should not be forgotten. Factory work was tiring, often dangerous, and done under constant pressure to meet goals. Long shifts, sometimes 12 hours or more, became normal. Injuries from heavy machinery were common, and the need for speed sometimes was more important than safety. Yet despite these problems, morale often stayed strong. Workers were proud to know that the bombers or tanks they made would soon be used against Germany or Japan. War bond campaigns, patriotic rallies, and factory visits by celebrities helped keep up this sense of purpose. Another remarkable thing was how widespread war industries were across the country. While Detroit, Pittsburgh, and the coastal shipyards remained big industrial centers, new factories popped up in unexpected places. Rural towns in the Midwest suddenly had plants making munitions or aircraft parts. Communities that had never known large-scale industry saw their populations double or triple almost overnight. Schools, housing, and services struggled to keep up with the influx of workers, creating a new kind of home-front community shaped by war production. The contributions of these workers went beyond just making things. The experience permanently changed expectations. Women in particular discovered independence and skills that changed their roles in post-war America. While many were forced out of factories after 1945, the precedent had been set. They had proven they could do well in heavy industry. African American workers also brought their wartime contributions into the growing civil rights movement, pointing to their role in defeating fascism abroad as a reason for demanding equality at home. In the short term, however, their efforts made sure that factories did not slow down. Aircraft plants kept delivering thousands of planes each month. Shipyards launched vessels in record time, and tank factories in Michigan and Ohio ran without stopping. Germany, on the other hand, relied more and more on forced labor from occupied territories, who were often untrained and unhappy, which hurt efficiency and quality. America's workforce, although stretched thin and often overworked, remained motivated by a belief that their hard work and sacrifice were building the very weapons of victory. By 1943, the change in America's labor force was complete. The war was not only fought by soldiers overseas, but by welders, riveters, machinists, and factory foremen at home. The industrial miracle that overwhelmed Germany was not built only on steel and oil. It was built on human hands, millions of them working tirelessly in every part of the country. Even as America's assembly lines roared to life, Germany's own industrial machines struggled under the weight of war. The difference between the two systems could not have been greater. While the United States used centralized planning, standard designs, and plenty of resources, Germany's factories were still split up, troubled by different interests, and increasingly short of important materials. This imbalance explains why in just 2 years, America's production went past the Reich's, even though Germany had started rearming much earlier. A major problem for Germany was its leadership structure. Hitler often interfered in production decisions, favoring impressive projects or experimental superweapons over practical mass production. For example, instead of focusing on one tank design, German industry made Panzer III, Panzer IV, Tiger, and Panther models at the same time, each needing unique parts and specialized facilities. This lack of standardization slowed manufacturing, stretched supply chains thin, and forced mechanics in the field to deal with constant shortages of spare parts. On the other hand, America focused on fewer standard models like the M4 Sherman and the P-51 Mustang, making sure that parts could be swapped and repairs were easy. A lack of resources made Germany's problems worse. The Reich did not have significant domestic supplies of oil, rubber, and certain metals. Synthetic substitutes were developed, but they were expensive and not as good. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 had been partly motivated by the desire to take resources. Yet, as the battle line stretched further, the supply network became more and more at risk. Allied bombing campaigns made the situation worse, destroying factories and transport routes. Even when German engineers designed advanced aircraft or tanks, production could not reach the size needed to change the strategic balance. Another difference appeared in labor. By 1942, millions of German men were drafted into the Wehrmacht, leaving factories with too few workers. The Nazi regime responded by bringing in forced labor from occupied territories. Millions of civilians and prisoners of war were forced to work under harsh conditions. While this filled gaps for a while, the quality of labor was not consistent, and unhappiness among forced workers hurt efficiency. America, meanwhile, used voluntary labor, women, African Americans, and immigrants who were motivated by wages and patriotism. This difference in morale led to higher productivity and reliability in American factories. Industrial decentralization also hurt Germany. Many factories were small or medium-sized workshops spread across different regions, making it hard to coordinate. Unlike America's giant integrated plants, such as Willow Run or the Detroit Arsenal, Germany rarely focused production on a massive scale. Even Albert Speer, who was appointed armaments minister in 1942, admitted the inefficiency and tried to make production more logical. He did make some progress, especially increasing the output of tanks and aircraft between 1942 and 1944. But by then, the Allies' industrial advantage was overwhelming. Speer himself later said that Germany's inability to match America's streamlined system was a major factor. The Luftwaffe's decline clearly shows the problem. German factories built around 30,000 aircraft in 1944, their best year. As impressive as that number seems, America produced over 96,000 planes the same year. Also, Germany faced fuel shortages and lacked trained pilots because of increasing combat losses, meaning many planes never saw real use. In tanks, the difference was just as clear. While Germany produced a few thousand heavy Tigers and Panthers, America and its allies had tens of thousands of Shermans. The effect on the battlefield was clear. German forces were often outnumbered 5 or 10 to 1 in both air and ground battles. Germany's inability to fully mobilize its economy until late in the war also proved costly. Unlike the United States, which changed civilian industries almost overnight after 1941, Germany delayed total mobilization until 1943. Civilian goods continued to be produced well into the conflict, partly because of political fears of unrest if consumer supplies disappeared. By the time full-scale mobilization began, Allied bombing campaigns were crippling production centers, erasing the gains of Speer's reforms. In the end, the story of Germany's industrial weakness is about fragmentation versus unity. The Reich had brilliant engineers and some of the most advanced technology of the time, but its inability to focus resources and standardize output made it weak. America's factories, on the other hand, produced waves of standard equipment that could be replaced faster than losses happened. Within 2 years, the numbers spoke for themselves. The United States was producing more planes, ships, and tanks than Germany could hope to match, giving them an advantage that no tactical skill or technological innovation could overcome. By the time 1943 arrived, the full impact of America's industrial change was being felt on every battlefield. The numbers alone told a shocking story. In just 2 years of total war, U.S. factories had made more than 45,000 tanks, over 80,000 warplanes, and thousands of ships, from Liberty cargo vessels to fleet carriers. These numbers were much bigger than the combined production of Germany, Italy, and Japan. It was not just output, it was momentum. Each month, America produced more than the Axis could in a year during the early war period, creating a never-ending flow of material. The impact on Allied operations was immediate. In North Africa, American-built Sherman tanks and trucks gave British and U.S. forces the ability to move like never before, overwhelming Rommel's Afrika Korps, which struggled with fuel shortages and fewer reinforcements. In the skies over Europe, waves of American bombers, B-17s, and B-24s bombed German industry day and night, helped by a constant flow of replacements from factories back home. Even after heavy losses in raids over places like Schweinfurt or Regensburg, bomber groups could be filled up quickly. Germany, on the other hand, lacked the ability to replace losses at the same rate, slowly losing its air force. In the Pacific, the story was just as clear. Aircraft carriers made in record numbers at American shipyards allowed the U.S. Navy to take control after Midway. The Essex-class carriers, supported by fleets of Hellcats and Avengers, rolled out of shipyards so quickly that by 1944, the United States had overwhelming naval air power. Japan, relying on fewer resources and a smaller industrial base, simply could not keep up. American factories made sure that every lost ship or aircraft was replaced many times over, while Axis losses became permanent. The size of logistical support also showed America's dominance. U.S. industry produced over 2 million trucks and jeeps, vehicles that kept Allied armies moving from Normandy to Berlin. German forces, often using horse-drawn carts for supplies, could not move as fast. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union received over 400,000 American trucks through Lend-Lease, allowing Red Army offensives to move faster than retreating Wehrmacht units. Behind every Soviet advance was American rubber, steel, and gasoline shipped across oceans and deserts. What made these achievements possible was not only resources, but also planning. The War Production Board managed a balance between different needs, making sure aircraft, tanks, and ships were produced together, rather than working against each other. Standardization was the main idea. Factories produced long runs of uniform models, allowing for repairs, replacements, and supply chains to work smoothly. Germany's use of many, often over-engineered models looked impressive on paper, but fell apart under the pressure of constant losses. Another often missed part was the morale boost that such production brought. Soldiers in the field knew they could count on steady resupply. Pilots shot down 1 month could return to the cockpit in new machines shortly after. This confidence in continuity built trust, and helped offensive operations. Axis soldiers, on the other hand, often fought knowing that destroyed tanks or aircraft could not be easily replaced. The mental edge created by America's output was as strong as the material advantage itself. By late 1943, people around the world recognized the change. Winston Churchill said that the United States was producing machines of war in such large numbers that it was hard to imagine. German generals looking at intelligence reports knew that America's factories were a major threat. Even Albert Speer admitted that no matter how well German factories worked, they could not compete with America's size and resources. The war was becoming a test of endurance, and the outcome was already clearly in favor of the Allies. In just 2 years, America had changed from a nation still recovering from the Depression into the clear arsenal of the Allied cause. Steel mills, shipyards, and assembly lines had produced not just machines, but victory itself. The final result of the war would still take sacrifice and combat, but the industrial flow had already decided the outcome. Victory was no longer a question of if, but when. America's factories had outbuilt Germany, and in doing so, they had changed the balance of global power for many years to come.